This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Lee, later this year will mark the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. How far have we come since then?
Well, we've come a long way, certainly if we live in Eastern or Central Europe, because they were living under communism for some 40 years, and the Berlin Wall symbolized that in terms of cutting off Eastern and Central Europe from the rest of the world. So that's down, and not only is that part of the world now open to freedom and democracy, but also if we look at Berlin, which was divided at that time by that terrible wall, and it became and has become a symbol, I think, of freedom and democracy as well, not only for Germany, but for the entire world.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Lee Edwards. He's a leading historian and a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Lee has been the author or editor of 25 books. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Lee about the Berlin Wall, the world that created it, and the world that brought it down. The Berlin Wall was as much a symbol for communist oppression as it was a barrier created to contain citizens of communist East Germany. At the end of World War II, the Allies held two peace conferences in Yalta and Potsdam to determine the post-war map of the world. The key figures at those conferences were Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States. Tensions were already rising between the West and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. In this context, the Allies decided to split Germany into 4 Allied zones to weaken the threat of the country re-emerging as a threat to world peace. The eastern part of the country would be controlled by the Soviet Union, and the western part would fall under the control of the United States, Britain, and later France would join. While Berlin is located in the eastern part of Germany, at those conferences, it was determined that this capital city had such significance that it too should be divided. Going forward, West Berlin became a thriving westernized city and enjoyed post-war prosperity, even though it was located deep inside communist East Germany. East Berlin, on the other hand, remained in dire straits under the tight grip of communism. The Soviets decided to drive the West out of West Berlin in 1948. They initiated a Soviet blockade of West Berlin to starve the Western Allies out of the city. The U.S. and its allies decided to airlift humanitarian aid to West Berliners. Eventually, the blockade ended, but tensions continued as the Soviets and the U.S. as superpowers engaged in a nuclear arms race for global domination. By 1958, the Soviets lost large numbers of skilled workers to the West as more and more East Germans sought freedom in the West. By June of 1961, roughly 19,000 people left East Germany through Berlin. On August 12, 1961, roughly 2,400 refugees defected through Berlin in a single day. This was the largest number of people to leave East Germany in one day. That night, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev approved East Germany's plans to stop the flow of refugees by closing its border. In one night, part of the Berlin Wall was built. This did not diffuse tensions, but it had the opposite effect. While it slowed the flood of refugees going from communism to freedom, it only exacerbated Cold War tensions. Still, this did not stop everyone from trying to escape communist oppression. 171 people died trying to defect, while another 5,000 East Germans found a way to successfully reach freedom in the West. In this episode, we talked with Lee Edwards about the wall, what it represented, and its fall. Lee, I know you've been the author and editor of many books, but there is one book you've written that provides a context for what we'll talk about today, and that's your book titled A Brief History of the Cold War. Can you tell us how you came to write that book?
Well, Tim, actually, I've been talking about the fact that there was no really good textbook out there for use in classes on the Cold War. There was all the usual studies from the left in which they said, well, the United States was to blame for the Cold War, or at least both sides, both the Soviet Union and the United States, were to blame for the Cold War. And talking about it with our daughter Elizabeth, who has a PhD and who teaches here in Washington, D.C., we both agreed that what was necessary was a textbook which was fair, which was balanced, and which would tell the facts, starting with a very real one, Jim, that we did not start the Cold War. That was started by the Soviet Union, which reneged on its promises at the Yalta Summit, promised to have free elections in Eastern and Central Europe, did not. And as a result of that, you had to have a Cold War.
Many people today may not have been alive during the Cold War while it was raging. Can you tell them what they missed? What was it about the Cold War that may be forgotten today?
Well, I think what you have to realize that in 1945, 46, 47, which is when the Cold War began, there was really a question, and the question before the world really was, would the world be dominated by the forces of totalitarianism led by the Soviets, or the principles of economic and political freedom led by the United States? And there was really a question, which would it be? Because, as I indicated earlier, Eastern and Central Europe was now cut off. Berlin was sliced in two. The Soviets were busy supporting communist parties in France and Italy. And the socialists had just taken control in Great Britain. So when you looked around, it seemed that the whole world was turning left. And this is what the Cold War was fought about. And this is what the United States did, was to assume a position of leadership in that battle on behalf of the free world. Fortunately for us living today, the forces of freedom won. But it was a long battle, 40 years, fought on many, many different fronts. But the United States was always there providing leadership again and again.
Lee, one of the questions a lot of people have that may not be familiar with the Cold War is why we called it a war. Usually when you talk about war, you're talking about military and combat. What characteristics of the Cold War actually gave it that definition of war?
Well, it was both a Cold War, but also sometimes it was a hot war. You take, for example, the situation in Korea. North Korea invaded the South. There had to be a response to that, or else all of that peninsula would be communist. The United States stepped forward, working with the United Nations, challenged North Korea, and ultimately was able to turn it back. And of course, Vietnam. Vietnam was not just a civil war between the North and the South of Vietnam. It really was a vital conflict in the Cold War. So it was a war in which both sides, both the forces of tyranny with the communists and the forces of freedom led by us, saw it just as that, as a conflict, as a war, and not just a meaningless debate.
And that was on the China side. On the Soviet side, we talk about the Berlin Wall as a symbol, but it was a little bit more than a symbol. The Berlin Wall was 87 miles long, and it became a symbol of communist oppression and the stark differences between communist oppression and the freedom of the West. How did the Berlin Wall come to be such a focal point for the entire Cold War?
We had, on the West, we had always seen Berlin as a major symbol of freedom. And we were determined, West Berlin particularly, we were determined that it would remain that. For example, going way back in 1947-48, there was a blockade attempted by the Soviets in which they cut off West Berlin to receive food or supplies, medicines, and so forth. And what did we do? We initiated an airlift, which we continued for 1 year. Just millions and millions and millions of pounds of food and medicine and other supplies, which we sent in by plane to one airport there in West Berlin. Stalin, who was the chief Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at the time, couldn't believe it and didn't think that we could keep it up, but we did for 1 year, and then he withdrew and stopped the blockade. So Berlin had always been that really key symbol, and of course the famous visit to Berlin by John F. Kennedy, in which he looked out at 1 million or 2 people and said, Ich bin ein Berliner, I'm a Berliner, so are all people, joining with the people of Berlin.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
And then finally, Mr. Reagan, President Reagan, in 1987, going to the Brandenburg Gate and saying, "Dear Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So it really was something which mattered so much to us, and really became a symbol, as I say, not just to Germany, not just to Europe, but to the entire world.
One of the things I learned many years ago about Berlin and why it became of strategic importance was that we were coming off of World War II, and the Allies were concerned that a united Germany could have a resurgence again and become a threat to world peace. So they decided to divide up Germany, and then Berlin, because of its influence as the capital city of Germany, also had to be divided up. How concerned were they? Was that concern justified that a united Berlin back in those late 1940s could actually lead to another resurgence of the Germany that threatened the world in World War I and World War II?
Well, there were certainly people in Britain and also in the United States who felt that way, and therefore they wanted to make sure that Germany could not have any kind of resurgence. That was, frankly, pretty much unlikely at that point. Germany was decimated by the war. It lost millions of people. Its industries and cities had been leveled. It did not have any system anymore for a governing party or a legislature or a central administration. And so people wanted to make sure that Berlin would never be able to do that. What happened, of course, was that Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of Germany, made sure that did not happen. From the very beginning, he said we did not want to have Germany in any way duplicate what it had done before, and worked so very hard, Konrad Adenauer, to bring Germany into Europe, into what became the European Union, which is where it is today. So I don't think that threat was probably as major as some people felt at that time. But at the same time, one can understand that, Tim. After all, we just come through this terrible war. The Nazis had done terrible things to the Jews, killing 6 million of them and wiping out many, many others, taking over and dominating all of Western Europe. So there was you could understand why people were reacting that way. But we made sure through the various diplomatic and political and strategic decisions that would not be possible, that Germany could not rise again.
Well, we had then two Germanys. We had East Germany and West Germany, and as you mentioned earlier, there was such a stark difference between the two. The western side of West Germany and West Berlin were prosperous. East Germany and East Berlin were reflecting the dire straits of communism and oppression. Can we talk a little bit about life during the Cold War in East Germany? It was a very sad place, actually. What was life like under the East Germans and the Soviets?
Well, as a matter of fact, Tim, I did visit West Berlin. While I was there, I walked over into East Berlin. This was 1 month after the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. And so I spent a day in East Berlin. It was one of the most depressing days I ever spent in my life. The whole city was gray. The skies were gray. The buildings were gray. The people were gray. The clothes were gray. And I was really mightily depressed spending that day there. And you could see that they had not made any attempt really to rebuild. And they were, I think, living a life of deprivation, of being cut off from the rest of Germany. And I think that to get out of East Berlin, which I finally did after spending that day there, and into West Berlin, where there were lights and people were smiling and laughing, and there were people were wearing gaily, gay clothes and so forth. It really was like leaving nighttime and getting into the middle of day at high noon. It was fantastic to be able to put that beside you. And one felt so sorry for the people of East Berlin and the lives that they were leading under the Soviets, because the Soviets really were controlling East Berlin through their satellite government of the East Germany.
But it was much more than the colors that you mentioned, too. It was the grays, because along with that, East Germans had no privacy, and tied to that, they were forced to spy on each other. Can you describe a little bit about what life was like under the oppression of communist rule?
Well, there's a wonderful film called The Lives of Others, which I would recommend our listeners to pick up. It's a powerful film, The Lives of Others, and it's about a Stasi, a secret police agent, who is listening in on a young couple who are breaking the rules and trying to speak out against the government, and he becomes their protector. He refuses to report on what they're actually saying and doing and planning. But that kind of heroism was all too rare. But at the same time, it reflects the fact that there were millions of people who were part of a secret police, who were informants for the Stasi for some 40 years. I think that you could tell that the life for an East German, it was just sort of swarming with eyes and ears of these secret agents. And then if you spoke out, you were put in jail. Sometimes you were eliminated. Sometimes you were executed. And just, the desire of the East Berliner to get out of East Berlin, I think, is most dramatized by their attempts to get over the wall. And of course, there are famous stories about how they would get themselves into a little VW, half a dozen of them, and try to drive across, or they would use gliders, or they would try to swim across the river which was there, and how through the barbed wire, jumping out of windows and so forth, over and over again. And some 200 East Berliners died that way, trying to escape tyranny, trying to escape the communist trap of East Berlin and East Germany.
There were so many stories of people that tried that. I made some notes. There was one, and some of these stories became sort of touch points. One of them was June 2nd, 1967. That's when a policeman shot a student during a protest. There were students on the East Germany side, East Berlin side, and at that time they were protesting a visit to Berlin of the Shah of Persia, which is now Iran. And they were protesting it, and a policeman shot a student. That was sort of a defining moment for some of the unrest on the eastern side, because there was somewhat of a student movement that the East Germans successfully suppressed for years. But that kind of illustrated just how stark it was if you stepped out of line in Germany, in East Germany, how the price was so high. There were other incidents too, and some of them involved what was called as Checkpoint Charlie. Can you describe some of the incidents that happened around Checkpoint Charlie that kind of highlighted the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States?
Well, Checkpoint Charlie was in the American sector of Berlin, and it was where you went through from there into East Germany. And as a matter of fact, it's where I went in. Just to give you some idea of just how tense that was, particularly in those early days in 61, which is when I went through there. I inadvertently got in sort of the wrong line and tried to walk across without being properly vetted by the East German police. And all of a sudden, as I was walking, I heard a click of a rifle and looked up, and there was a Polizei was pointing his rifle at me and motioning for me to get back in line, which I very quickly did. And so the fact that I was an American didn't make any difference to him. I was breaking the rules, and if I didn't obey them, I would be shot. It was just that simple. There's also, I believe, a famous case of Major Nicholson, who was caught sort of in between East and West was shot. We tried to send somebody over to rescue him. We were blocked from doing that, and so the major just died there on the spot, bled to death, as I recall. So these kinds of incidents were, I won't say everyday occurrences, but they happened all too frequently, and shows what happens when communists are in control, when they do not brook interference or challenges, when they will do anything to maintain their political control.
Well, you said you were there in 1961, and that was also a key year at that same checkpoint, October 1961. There was a dispute over whether East German guards could look at the travel documents of a U.S. diplomat. That diplomat's name was Alan Leitner. And from what we read, he wanted to go to East Berlin to see the opera. There was a dispute, and shortly after that, 10 Soviet tanks were stationed on one side of Checkpoint Charlie, and the same number of tanks from the United States were on the other side. They were 100 yards apart. And as with anything during the Cold War, there was always this threat of war. And it ended over a week after negotiations, but that just illustrates exactly how tense it was, not only between the United States and the Soviet Union, but how tense it was at the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, that's true, Tim. And I think also it's a reflection of at a higher level, the game, and it was really more than a game, but you can call it that, which was being played between Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader, and President Kennedy. Khrushchev was testing the will of the young president. This was still in his first year. It was following the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba, and of course it also followed the construction of the Berlin Wall. And Khrushchev thought that this was a weak president, somebody whom he could play with and toy with and bully. And Kennedy, with the following year in the Cuban Missile Crisis, proved Mr. Khrushchev to be very, very wrong. It was a high point of the Cold War, an act of courage and diplomacy by our president and by our leader, and a key event in the Cold War.
Well, you mentioned John F. Kennedy, and it was a little bit later than that. It was June of 1963 that he gave that speech you mentioned at the Berlin Wall. And I had a question for you on that. How powerful was that speech at that time in the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union?
Well, I think it was an extraordinary demonstration of how important East and West Berlin united, hopefully at some point, would be. And the fact that as I recall, over 1 million, maybe 1.5 million, maybe 2 million West Berliners turned out for Kennedy's speech and his appearance. He knew very well how important it was to make this stand of solidarity with the people of West Berlin, not only for them, but sending a signal to Khrushchev that we were not going to allow them to be forgotten, and that we would continue to do whatever we could to bring about their eventual freedom. It really was, and Kennedy wrote about it, talked about it. It was maybe the largest audience he ever addressed, and a very important highlight, I think, of this continuing battle, of this Cold War, which was sometimes cold, but sometimes not so cold.
There's an urban legend around that speech that I think has been dispelled, at least among the people that know, but it's still out there. And that is, John F. Kennedy he spoke in German. The translation, as he understood it, was, "I am a Berliner." But there was this urban legend that he screwed up the translation when he spoke German, and the words that came out to the Germans that listened were, "I am a jelly donut." That's the urban legend.
Well, it is not true, Tim, and I know a little bit about this because I was stationed in Germany for 18 months, a little bit earlier, that I did spend some time learning German. And so in terms of it's true that if you were to ask for a donut, that you'd say, I would like ein Berliner, and when you stick an article in front of it, ein. But if you have the phrase, ich bin ein Berliner, it's slang, and it's very clear that what you mean by that is, I am a Berliner, I am a citizen of this city. So this is what I would call, frankly, a cheap shot, a cheap shot at a very dramatic and a powerful, powerful moment in the Cold War.
I had a question for you then about another speech, and that was one it was sort of a bookend of the whole Berlin Wall story, and that is Ronald Reagan's speech. Friday, June 12th, 1987, Ronald Reagan gave a historic speech of his own at the Berlin Wall. In it, he stepped up his pressure on the Soviet Union. He reinforced strong positions against the oppression of communism, and then he delivered the now famous line where he called Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, as you mentioned.
We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
How impactful was that speech?
Well, Tim, just some back history on this. Back in 1978 or 79, somewhere in there, Reagan, along with Dick Allen, who became his national security advisor, was visiting some European capitals. This is before he declared that he was going to run for president again, and that happened in 1979. So this probably was 78. And they were and visited Berlin, talked to Helmut Kohl, who was chancellor at the time, and they stood there at the Brandenburg Gate, looking at the wall, which had been there since 1961. And Allen waited for Reagan, who was past governor of California, to say something. And finally he looked up and he said to Allen, that thing has to come down. That thing has to come down. So let's jump forward to 1987. He's in Berlin. He's at the Brandenburg Gate. And he had told his speechwriter, Peter Robinson, a couple of months before when they were working on this speech, he said, when he was asked, well, what would you like to say? He said, I would like to say something about bringing down that wall. And so it was Peter who came up with the phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, reflecting and being consistent with the president's wishes. The State Department, over and over and over again, tried to knock out that sentence. A month before, a couple of weeks before, and I'm told, unbelievably, that day that he was going to give it, they had again knocked out that line. And Reagan talked to Peter Robinson. He said, now, I am the president, right, Peter? Yes, sir, you are. And I can say what I want to say, right? Yes. Well, then I want to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So there was the president, knowing how important it was to say something at that time, at that place, to keep the pressure on Mr. Gorbachev, with whom he was negotiating on doing away with nuclear weapons, to let him know not only was he going to hold on to SDI, but he was going to hold on to the idea that Berlin must be free once again.
Well, the SDI that you said he would hold on to was that Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative. On November 9th, 1989, East Berlin's Communist Party announced a change in its travel ban with the West. They said that East German citizens were now free to cross the city's borders, and both East and West Berliners descended on the wall and celebrated together. The guards opened up the checkpoints, and 2 million people from both East and West joined together. And then not long after that, they started to physically tear that wall down. I did have to ask you not only about Reagan's speech, but his policies. What do you think about his role in bringing an end to the Berlin Wall and ultimately communist Soviet Union?
Well, we can take the word of some of the most distinguished historians that he was more responsible than any other president and any other Western leader for doing that. By bringing pressure to bear, both through rhetoric, through powerful speeches like the Ash Heap of History and Evil Empire, through the Reagan Doctrine, in which he was supporting anti-communist forces in places like Nicaragua and Afghanistan, through economic warfare, in which he made it more difficult for the Soviets to sell their oil reserves, and through working through the Pope and the Vatican to help the solidarity in Poland. So over and over again, you can see that these deliberate, discrete actions taken by the president, to the extent that Lech Walesa, the famous Polish Union leader and later president of Poland, put it very simply. He said, we owe our liberty to him, meaning President Reagan. So it was an extraordinary, it seems to me, act of statesmanship, of leadership by the president, by Mr. Reagan, freeing 100 million people behind the Iron Curtain, freeing Berlin, and really, truly ending the Cold War. As Margaret Thatcher once put it, ending the Cold War without firing a shot.
Lee, you wrote about the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall, and you talked about the lessons of it. And I know that you mentioned that the West enjoyed prosperity and freedom while the East had fallen into economic and political morass with the Berlin Wall. What other lessons were there from the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, I think we learned a couple of things. We learned that allies matter, that we needed the support of Great Britain and the people of Germany, the people of Western Europe. It was not a question of the U.S. doing it all by itself. We learned that leadership is essential, that people like Mr. Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and John Paul II, who did come together and with a policy of victory, not just containment, they learned that it's important to work from a belief, a philosophy, if you will, not just a strategy, but a strategy based upon certain high principles. And for us, of course, it's always been the idea of freedom and democracy and justice for all people. So to me, the Cold War was one of the most important events of the 20th century. So often we focus on World War I or World War II, but I think the Cold War deserves to have as much attention and much analysis, and to learn from as much as any other conflict in the 20th century.
Lee Edwards, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Tim.
To learn more about Lee Edwards' books and work and about the Berlin Wall, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join, a Facebook page you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.